There's a certain kind of morning that feels like yours. Not because anything special is happening in it, but because it's quiet in a way you've learned to trust. That was most of my mornings. I'd be up by 6:15. Coffee started before I was fully awake. The garden visible from the kitchen window, even in November, especially in November actually, when everything had gone brown and still, and you could see the actual shape of things without all the green in the way. I liked that about late fall, the honesty of it. I'm an occupational therapist, have been for close to 25 years. I work with people who are relearning how to do ordinary things after something has taken those things away from them. How to button a shirt, how to hold a cup, how to navigate a kitchen after a stroke has rearranged the map inside their head. People assume the job must be exhausting, and sometimes it is, but mostly it suits me. I'm good at steady, I'm good at patient. I've always known how to wait for someone to get where they're going without making them feel watched. My daughter Callie lives in Seattle. Graphic designer, sharp, opinionated, more certain of her own feelings than I ever managed to be at 27. We talk a few times a week. My ex-husband David lives about 40 minutes away, and we are long past each other in the way that's actually peaceful rather than the way that's just people performing peace. We raised Callie well together. After that, we ran out of things to do together. That was 8 years ago now, and I have mostly stopped measuring time in terms of it. I had made myself a good life. I want to be honest about that part. I'm not telling you a story about a woman who had nothing. I had the job I wanted. I had a daughter I was proud of. I had a house that was mine, small and tidy, with a garden I tended carefully and a kitchen that smelled like coffee in the mornings and like whatever I was cooking by evening. It was a good life. There was just something in the center of it that had been a little quiet for a long time. Something I had mostly stopped listening for. But that's not where this story starts. This story starts with a doorbell at 7:43 on a Tuesday morning in November. I remember the exact time because I had my work bag over my shoulder and my keys in my hand. I was 12 minutes from leaving. The doorbell didn't ring often enough for me to have any particular reflex to it, and so I stood there for just a second, keys still in my hand, before I went to answer it. I opened the door. My mother was standing on the front step. She had 2 large suitcases with her, the hard-sided kind, dark blue, the one she'd had since before my father got sick, and a grocery bag hanging off her left wrist, the plastic kind from a drugstore. With what I could see, even from where I stood, were prescription bottles. She looked smaller than I remembered. That's the first thing I noticed. She had always been a solid woman. Present. The kind of person who took up the appropriate amount of space in a room. But standing there on my front step in her good coat, the one she wore to things she considered important, she looked like someone who had recently lost some of herself. She looked at me, and then she said, "I didn't know where else to go." I had not spoken to my mother in 4 months, not since the estate sale. Not since I'd learned, through a neighbor, of all people, at the gathering after my father's funeral, the casual offhand way a neighbor mentions something she assumes you already know, that the family home had been signed over to my brother Kevin more than 2 years earlier, while my father was still alive, while he was still in that house. I had found out on a Sunday afternoon in July, standing beside a folding table with a cup of weak coffee in my hand, and I had said nothing. I had nodded. I had set the cup down. I had found my car. And I hadn't cried until I was parked in my own driveway 20 minutes later with the engine still running. I stopped calling Lorraine after that. Not all at once. Gradually, the way I do most things. Less often, then less often still, until 4 months had passed without her voice, and I had told myself that the silence was something I'd chosen rather than something that had happened to me. And now she was on my doorstep, with 2 suitcases, and the prescription bag. The suitcases meant Kevin had made the house uncomfortable enough that she'd left. I didn't know that as a certainty yet, standing there, but I knew it the way you know certain things. Quietly, in the part of you that has been paying attention for years, even when you wished it would stop. I stepped back. I let her in. I didn't do it because I had forgiven anything. I did it because I was raised to. That's not the same thing. I had spent most of my life believing it was, but standing there, watching my mother wheel one of those blue suitcases across my threshold, I was beginning to understand the difference. I called my office, said I'd be in by noon. I took her coat. I made tea. The guest room in my house is small, a single bed, a window that looks onto the side of the house rather than the garden, a dresser that had belonged to David's grandmother and that he'd left because neither of us could agree on who it really belonged to. I'd put a quilt on the bed years ago, a blue and white one, and never changed it. I hadn't had many overnight guests. I made the room ready while my mother sat at my kitchen table. I put clean towels in the bathroom. I cleared space in the medicine cabinet and lined her prescriptions up on the shelf in the order she'd need them. Blood pressure, thyroid, the small white one I didn't recognize. I didn't ask about it. When I came back to the kitchen, she was still at the table, not looking at her phone, not looking out the window, just sitting with her hands folded and her eyes on the middle distance, the way people sit when they've been through something they're not ready to describe yet. We drank our tea, we talked around the edges of things. She said the drive had been long. I said it would have been this time of year. She said she wasn't sleeping well. I said that happened sometimes. I asked whether she'd eaten, and she said she'd had something on the road. She did not explain why she was there. And I did not ask. Not yet. Later, after she'd gone to the guest room and closed the door, I went to my own bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. I called Callie. She answered on the second ring, the way she always did when she could see it was me. I told her. She was quiet for about 1 second, and then she was not quiet at all. She wanted to know what I was thinking. She wanted to know what I was going to say to her. She wanted to know if I needed her to come. Her voice had that particular edge it gets when she is frightened on my behalf, and calling it anger because anger is easier to hold on to. I said, I know. I need you to be patient with me. She said my name once with everything in it that she didn't say out loud. I know, I told her again. Give me a little time. After we hung up, I stood at my bedroom window for a while. The garden was dark by then, just shapes and shadows, the rose canes I hadn't cut back yet scratching slightly against the fence in the wind. November. Nothing out there was growing. Everything was just waiting to see what winter would ask of it. I had felt something like this before. Not this exact weight, not this particular version of it, but this feeling of having opened a door before I decided whether I wanted to, of having made room for something and then standing very still, wondering what I'd just let in. I had been doing it my whole life. I just hadn't always had a word for it. I turned off the light. I got into bed. In the guest room down the hall, my mother was probably already asleep. She settled in the way a person does when they don't quite believe the arrangement is permanent and don't quite believe it isn't. The first few days were practical. I booked her a doctor's appointment with someone in my network, a GP who was good with older patients, patient with paperwork, didn't rush people through. I went through her prescriptions and refilled the 2 that were running low. I adjusted my schedule so I could be home by 5 instead of 6. These were the kinds of things I knew how to do. I had been doing versions of them for years, for my father, for patients, for whoever the situation required. I did them without being asked because I had long ago stopped waiting to be asked. My mother and I were polite with each other in the way of 2 people who are aware of something large between them and have agreed, without saying so, to leave it alone for now. And then, around the 4th day, she began to talk. Not about anything important, at first. She talked about the weather. She talked about a television program she'd been watching. She mentioned that the drive to my house had seemed longer than she remembered it being. But gradually, the way water finds its level, she worked her way toward it. She said Kevin had been under a lot of pressure lately. Business was unpredictable. Things were stressful at the house. She said it the way mothers say things about their struggling children, with a softness that I recognized, that I had heard my entire life when she talked about him. That particular tenderness she kept in a place she didn't seem to have a second one of. Then she talked about the house transfer. She explained it carefully. She used words like probate complications and Medicaid estate recovery, and I could hear Kevin in every phrase, his cadence, his reasonableness, the way he could make something self-serving sound like good planning. She said it had been the practical thing to do. She said the lawyer had agreed. She said it was always meant to simplify things, not to exclude anyone. And then she said, "You always had your own life, Diane," gently, said with something that was almost admiration. I nodded. I refilled her coffee. I did not say anything. I had heard that sentence before, or versions of it, more times than I could count. "You've always been so independent. You never needed as much as Kevin did. You were always the strong one." They were meant as compliments. I knew that. They were offered with genuine warmth. But underneath each one, like a note played too low to quite hear, was the same implication. You didn't need what he needed. You were always going to be fine. I had spent a long time believing that was true. Letting it be true, maybe. It was easier than the alternative. I asked her careful questions, not to push, just to understand the shape of things. When had the transfer happened exactly? Had my father known about it? Had they talked to anyone else first? She answered in the way people answer when they've already made peace with something and don't want to be pulled back into the uncertainty of it. She said your father was involved. She said it was discussed. She said it all sounded very sensible at the time. I listened. I made tea. I let her talk. At some point she mentioned that Kevin's girlfriend had been making some changes to the house. Updating the kitchen, painting a few rooms. She mentioned it with a particular kind of flatness, reporting information she found uncomfortable but hadn't quite let herself react to yet. I asked, the same way I might ask about the weather. "Did you bring any of Grandma Ruth's things with you?" She thought about it. She said there hadn't been room, really. Things had been rushed. She said most of her mother's things were still at the house, and then she said, as though it were simply one more detail in a list of details, the blue mixing bowl was still in the kitchen. The one with the chip on the rim. Kevin's girlfriend used it now. I said, "Oh, something like that." And then I got up to make more tea, which we didn't need. I stood at the counter with my back to her for a few seconds, long enough. I'm not sure exactly what I was doing, just not looking at anything in particular. Just standing with it for a moment before I turned around. That bowl had sat on the shelf in my grandmother's kitchen, and then my mother's kitchen, for as long as I could remember. It was wide and deep, and the blue had faded to something almost gray near the base. It was chipped on the rim from some incident decades before I was born. My mother and I used to make pound cake in it on Sunday afternoons, just the two of us, before Kevin came along and the Sundays reorganized themselves around him. I had always assumed, in the wordless way you assume certain things, that it would come to me eventually, not because I'd asked for it, not because it was worth anything. Just because some things belong to a person and you know it the way you know your own handwriting. I didn't say any of that. I brought the tea back to the table. We talked about something else. Later, after she'd gone to bed, she was tired early those days, asleep by 8:30. I sat at my kitchen table with the lights turned low. I was thinking about a spring afternoon when I was 14 years old. My father had been in a car accident that winter. Serious enough, a broken collarbone, a long recovery, weeks in the hospital, and then months at home where he couldn't drive and couldn't work and needed more from all of us than any of us had known to prepare for. My mother had fallen apart a little during that time. Not in a dramatic way. Just in the way that competent people sometimes collapse when the thing they feared most nearly happens, quietly, privately, in ways she probably didn't realize we noticed. I had held things together. I was 14. I knew how to make dinner by then. I helped Kevin with his homework. I kept track of my father's medications. I didn't ask for much attention because the situation seemed to require that I not. And then my father recovered. Spring came. My mother returned to herself, the capable woman she normally was, and life resumed. In April, she took Kevin out for his birthday, just the two of them, a tradition she'd started with him when he was small. A special dinner, just the two of them, because Kevin liked that kind of thing. My birthday was in June. She didn't take me anywhere, not out of meanness, I know that. She just didn't. She assumed, the way she had always assumed, that I was fine, that I didn't need the fuss, that I understood. I told myself I understood. I had been telling myself that for 37 years. And now I was sitting in my kitchen at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night in November, with a woman sleeping in my guest room who still, to this day, had never once asked me what I actually wanted. I didn't feel angry sitting there. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was older and quieter than anger. I felt it the way you feel, something you have carried so long you forgot it had a name. Callie arrived on a Friday evening with an overnight bag and a bottle of wine she bought at the airport, which was very Callie, the gesture of someone who understands that some situations call for wine even when wine won't help. I had cooked an actual dinner for the first time since my mother arrived. Roast chicken, the kind that takes an hour and a half and makes the house smell like something. I hadn't realized until I was pulling it out of the oven how much I'd needed to do something that required my full attention and rewarded it. The three of us ate together. It was careful, the way dinners are when people are navigating around something no one has agreed to discuss yet. My mother was pleasant. Callie was pleasant. They asked each other polite questions. The food was good. I kept refilling water glasses that didn't need refilling. After dinner, my mother said she was tired and went to bed. She'd moved to the smaller room by then. Callie had the guest room, and I heard her door close down the hall, and then the house was just me and my daughter and the wine she'd brought. We cleaned up the kitchen together without talking much. That was fine. Callie has always known when to wait. The Saturday that mattered came after lunch, when my mother lay down for a nap, and Callie and I moved to the living room with our coffee and the quiet of an early November afternoon coming through the windows. Callie asked how I was doing, not the social version of the question, the real one. She was watching me the way she sometimes does, with that particular quality of attention she has, patient and unblinking. She gets it from her father, but she uses it better than he ever did. I said I was managing. She asked what my mother needed, practically speaking, how long she might stay, whether I'd thought about next steps. I answered those questions. They were easy. I had been answering those kinds of questions my whole life. Then she asked, a little more carefully, "What do you want, Mom?" And I stopped. I don't know how long I was quiet. Long enough that Callie didn't feel the silence, which meant she could tell something was happening. I said, "I'm not sure anyone's asked me that in a while." She didn't react to that, which was the right thing. She just waited. So I started talking, more than I usually do. I told her about the last few years of her grandfather's illness, the parts she'd witnessed from a distance and the parts she hadn't seen. The every weekend drives, 4 hours each way, on roads that all start to look the same after enough repetitions. The care team I coordinated, the insurance appeals I'd written, the second neurologist they denied twice before I found the right language to make them reconsider. I told her about the morning her grandfather died, that I was there, that Kevin arrived 4 hours later. I wasn't saying it to indict anyone. I want to be clear about that. I was trying to explain something that I was only just beginning to find words for, that I had been present, that I had chosen over and over again to show up, and that I had hoped, not consciously, not in a way I'd ever let myself articulate, that being present would eventually mean something. Not money, not the house, not exactly. Something more like acknowledgement. Something like being seen and chosen and said to directly, "We know what you did, and it mattered." Callie listened to all of it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "They chose Kevin before you even had a chance to make a case." I looked at my coffee. "I know," I said. "I think I always knew. I'll tell you the part I've never made easy for myself to think about. 2 months before my father died, while he was still alive in that house and past the point of understanding most of what was happening around him, my mother signed the family home over to Kevin. I didn't know that then. I didn't know it until the estate sale, until a neighbor said something at the gathering afterward, mentioned the county transfer records the way you mention something you assume someone already knows. She was making conversation. I was holding a cup of bad coffee. I remember the sound of other people talking nearby and the way I kept my face very still while she was speaking. I didn't say anything. I found my car. I drove home. I didn't cry until I was in my own driveway with the engine still running, and then I did, and then I went inside. I never said anything to my mother. I called less often, then less often still. And then 4 months passed and she was standing on my front step with 2 suitcases. That Saturday evening, Callie went upstairs and I sat alone in my living room for a while. I picked up my phone. I have a photograph of my father from the last good summer. Not the version of him from when he was well and busy and fully himself, but the version from that final summer when the Parkinsons had already taken a lot and he knew it. He's looking at the camera. His expression is hard to describe. Not sad exactly, just very clear, like someone who has run out of the energy required to pretend things are other than they are. I looked at the photograph for a while. Then I turned the phone face down on the cushion beside me. I had grieved him. I had done that work, as much as that kind of work ever gets done. What I hadn't finished was something else. The grief that sits behind the first grief. The grief not for the person you lost, but for the family you discovered in losing them that you'd never quite had. 3 weeks in, my brother called. I was in the kitchen when my phone rang. A Wednesday afternoon, I think, around 4 o'clock. My mother was in the living room with the television on low. I saw Kevin's name on the screen, and I stood there for just a second before I answered. He sounded surprised that I picked up. Or maybe not surprised exactly, more like he'd prepared for a version of this conversation and was recalibrating to the actual one. He said he'd been meaning to call. He said he was glad I was there to help with Mom, he really was. He said things had just gotten complicated. I didn't say much. I made a sound that indicated I was listening, which is different from agreeing, though Kevin has always treated them as the same thing. He said my mother had chosen to leave. That was the word he used. Chosen. He said nobody had asked her to go anywhere. He said renovation work was loud and unpredictable, and he couldn't be expected to halt everything indefinitely. He said he and his girlfriend needed some normalcy. He said he had every intention of getting Mom set up somewhere appropriate just as soon as things settled down a little. I listened to all of it, the reasonableness of it, the way each sentence connected to the next, in a way that sounded, on the surface, like a person who had simply found himself in a difficult situation through no particular fault of his own. And then he said it. He said, "You've always handled things so much better than I do, Dee. You always land on your feet. Warm, genuine." He meant it as a compliment. I know that. I have always known that. I was quiet for a moment. Then I told him I had to go, and I ended the call. I put my phone on the counter. I sat down at the kitchen table. I sat there for maybe a minute, maybe less. I had heard that sentence many times, across many years. Different versions of it, but always the same shape underneath. You don't need what Kevin needs. You'll be fine. You always are. And I had always let it do what it was designed to do, absorb whatever I might have been about to say, wrap it in something that looked like recognition, and make it disappear. This time, something different happened. Not anger. I want to be clear about that. I didn't feel a wave of fury, didn't want to call him back and say all the things I'd never said. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of standing in a room and suddenly seeing it clearly. The actual dimensions of it. The actual distance between the walls, after years of moving through it in the dark. I got up and made dinner. That was what the evening required, so that was what I did. Callie showed up around 7:30, unannounced, with a manila folder tucked under her arm. She has her father's directness and my patience, which is an unusual combination and occasionally a formidable one. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table and placed the folder between us. She'd pulled the county transfer records from the public property database. She'd been sitting on the idea for weeks, she said, and she'd finally done it. I opened the folder. The date was on the first page. The transfer had been recorded 2 months before my father died. I knew this already from what the neighbor had said, but seeing it printed on an official document is different from hearing it at a gathering. It was specific in a way that the neighbor's version hadn't been. Lorraine Marsh, transferor. Kevin Marsh, transferee. Date. Notary. The name of the title company. Lorraine's signature, alone on the line. There was a second document, a summary Callie had put together after a phone call with my mother's former financial advisor. My mother had transferred money to Kevin across a 3-year period. $22,000 given in amounts that were described to the advisor as loans. None of them were documented with repayment terms. None of them, as far as anyone could tell, had been repaid. I read through it carefully. I do that. I read things all the way through before I respond to them. It's the same way I approach most things. When I finished, I set it down. I said, okay. Callie was watching me. I could feel her deciding whether to say something. I told her I needed to show it to my mother. She started to say something. I think she was about to mention lawyers, which is where her mind goes first and which is not unreasonable. I said, not to hurt her. I just want to know what she actually knows. Callie looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded. She stayed for a while. We had tea. She slept in the guest room. And sometime after 10, after the house had gone quiet, I sat alone at the kitchen table with the folder in front of me. I had spent years organizing paperwork, insurance forms and medical authorizations and estate documents and all the administrative weight that accumulates around a person who is sick and then around a person who has died. I had been the one who kept copies of things, the one who knew where the documents were, the one who could find, on short notice, a record from 4 years ago that everyone else had forgotten existed. It had never once occurred to me that one day I would be the one the paperwork was about. I sat with that for a while, just that. The folder on the table, the house quiet around me. And I thought about what I was going to say when I finally sat down across from my mother and asked her to tell me the truth. I waited 3 days. Not because I was afraid of the conversation. I'd had enough time with the folder, with the documents, with the facts laid out in their clean official language to understand that fear wasn't what I was feeling. What I needed was to know what I actually wanted from it, what I was hoping she would say. Because those are different things, what you want someone to say and what you're hoping they'll be capable of. And I'd spent enough of my life confusing them that I wanted to be clear about it this time. I wasn't going to court. I wasn't asking her to reverse anything. I just wanted, finally, for my mother to look at what had happened and say it plainly. Without the version Kevin had constructed, without the softening she'd been living inside for 2 years. I picked a Sunday afternoon. She was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, and she looked up the way she does when she's trying to read what kind of conversation is coming. I think she'd been expecting something for a while. She wasn't surprised when I sat down across from her and placed the transfer record on the table between us. I said, I need you to help me understand what happened. She looked at the paper for a long time. I watched her. She recognized it. I could tell she did, but she didn't pretend otherwise. She just looked at it. And then she began with what she knew, the familiar version: probate complications, estate costs. The Medicaid issue Kevin had explained, which she repeated almost word for word, and I recognized his phrasing in hers the way you recognize someone else's coat on a person you know. She said it quickly, the way people say things they've repeated enough times that the words have worn smooth. Then she stopped. She looked at the date on the document, and she was quiet for a moment. She said, I thought you'd be all right. I didn't answer right away. I sat with that sentence and let it be what it was, not a justification, not an excuse she was reaching for. Something closer to the truth than anything she'd said since she arrived, maybe closer to the truth than anything she'd said in years. I thought you'd be all right. The absolute faith in my resilience. The assumption so deep it had become invisible, like wallpaper you stop seeing because it's always been there. She hadn't worried about me. And at some point, not worrying about me had become the same thing, in her mind, as loving me well. I said quietly, I needed you to wonder. She looked up. Not worry, not choose me instead of Kevin, just wonder, ask. Notice that wondering was even something that might be worth doing. It's a small thing to ask for. It took me 51 years to find the word for it, she cried. Not dramatically. She's not a dramatic person, whatever else she is. She cried the way someone cries when a story they've been telling themselves quietly stops holding. She said she hadn't realized. She said Kevin had made it all sound so sensible. She said she thought I understood, that I always understood, that I had never seemed to need, and then she stopped, because even she could hear what she was saying. I waited. A full minute, maybe more. I didn't reach across the table. I didn't say it's okay or I know or any of the things I would have said before, reflexively, to fill the space and make it easier. I just sat with my own stillness while she sat with hers. It was the first time I'd done that. Let her pain be in the room without immediately making room for it ahead of my own. I didn't do it to punish her. I did it because it was finally true and I was tired of performing something else. After a while, the conversation found its way to something more. Not confession. She never quite arrived at the clean version of that. She couldn't say I chose Kevin over you in so many words. Some truths are too large for one sitting, and I understood that, and I didn't push her toward it. What she did say, slowly, after a long silence, was that she'd known for a long time that I carried things she'd never asked me to carry. That she told herself I didn't mind because I never said I did. I said I didn't say anything because saying things in our family always cost more than staying quiet. She had no answer for that. I wasn't trying to wound her with it, it was just the truth, and it landed the way true things land, not like a blow, but like something settling. Something finally touching the ground after a long time in the air. We sat there together for a while after that. The afternoon light was changing. Neither of us moved to make tea or clear the table or do any of the practical things we might normally do to signal that a conversation had ended. Because it hadn't ended. It had just reached the place where words were no longer quite the right tool for it. Something had been said, between us. Without performance, without strategy, without the softening we'd both spent decades applying to everything that mattered, I didn't know yet what it would become, whether it would become anything. Whether you can rebuild something that was never quite built right in the first place. But we were on different ground than we'd been that morning. That was true. Whatever else was uncertain, that much was true. Life after a hard conversation doesn't look the way you might expect. It doesn't look like resolution. It looks like Tuesday morning. It looks like someone else's prescriptions on your bathroom shelf and 2 coffee cups where there used to be one. The weeks after that Sunday afternoon were quiet in a different way than the weeks before it. Something had shifted in the quality of the silence between us. Not gone, not warm exactly, but different. Less like something being withheld and more like something that had finally been set down. I looked into senior living options in early December. Found 3 places within a reasonable distance, made some calls, took notes. I presented them to my mother the way I present most things, clearly, without apology, without softening it into something it wasn't. She was going to need to make a choice. These were the choices. She looked through the materials carefully, the way she does when she's trying to be fair to herself. She chose one. There was a waiting list. Several months, they thought. I said that was fine, because it was. What I noticed in the weeks that followed was that she had started asking questions, small ones, where I was going when I left in the morning. How a particular patient was doing. I'd mentioned him once, a man relearning how to button his shirts after a stroke, and she'd asked about him again 2 weeks later, which surprised me. How the garden looked. Whether I was sleeping all right. They weren't large gestures. She wasn't suddenly a different person. But they were questions she hadn't asked before, and I noticed each one the way you notice a sound in a house that's been quiet for a long time. One Sunday morning she made the coffee before I came downstairs. She'd been watching how I made it. I hadn't realized she'd been watching, and she made it correctly. She set a cup in front of me without saying anything about it. Then she sat down across from me, and after a moment she said, without preamble, without anything building up to it, "I didn't see you the way I should have." She didn't explain it. She didn't wrap it in qualifications or walk it back or follow it with but. She just said it, and then she picked up her own cup and looked out the window at the yard. I said, "I know. Not thank you. Not it's okay." Just, I know. Because I did know. And because I was learning, slowly, to accept things without immediately performing a feeling I wasn't quite ready to have yet. Kevin called her twice in the weeks that followed. Brief calls. He didn't call me. He wasn't going to change. I knew that before those calls happened, and the calls confirmed it without adding anything new. Some people are exactly who they are, completely and finally, and the most honest thing you can do is stop being surprised by it. My mother stopped defending him the way she used to, when his name came up, and it did, sometimes, just incidentally. She'd say, "He is who he is," and leave it there. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't wisdom, really. It was more like exhaustion finally crossing over into something that resembled clarity. I called Callie in mid-December to tell her I wasn't going to pursue anything legally. She was quiet for a moment when I said it. That particular quiet of hers where she's deciding whether to argue or listen. She listened. I told her I didn't think she was wrong, that I might have grounds. I told her a lawsuit would cost me 3 years and a significant amount of money, and whatever remained of the relationship was my mother, and that those were things I wasn't willing to spend on a process that might not give me anything I actually needed. I said, "This isn't forgiveness, it's a decision." She was quiet again. Then she said she understood. She said she was proud of me. I said, "I think I might be too." And I meant it. Not as a performance of confidence, not as the kind of thing you say to reassure someone. I actually meant it, which was new, and I sat with that for a moment after I said it. There's an evening I keep coming back to when I think about how things settled. My mother was at the kitchen table with a puzzle she'd been working on for 3 days, one of those landscapes with too much sky. I was making dinner. Nothing special, something that needed occasional attention and not much else. On the counter beside the stove there was a bowl, wide, heavy, dark green earthenware with a matte finish and a weight to it that I like. I'd bought it in October from a small shop near my office on a Wednesday afternoon when I had 20 minutes between appointments. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I just saw it and thought, I need a bowl. So I bought it. It sat on the counter full of apples, the way bowls do when you put them somewhere permanent. I had spent a long time thinking about a different bowl. The blue one, my grandmother's. The one with the chipped rim that I used to make Sunday cakes in with my mother when I was small, before the kitchen reorganized itself around Kevin. I'd imagined it on this counter, on my counter, for years, not because of what it was worth, because of what I thought its arrival would mean, that I had been counted. That someone had thought of me in that specific, material, undeniable way. It hadn't come. It was still in a house I had no reason to visit, and I had stopped expecting it. What I had instead was something I'd chosen myself on an ordinary Wednesday because I needed it. That's not the same as losing. I'm still working out what it is. But I stood at my counter that evening, with dinner on the stove and my mother doing her puzzle and the green bowl full of apples on the counter beside me, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happy, not healed, not finished with any of it, just present, in my own kitchen, in my own life. My phone rang. I looked at the screen. Callie. I dried my hands and picked up.